I have to say, first of all, thank you for inviting me to offer some reflections. For me, like I imagine for a lot of you, it's really astonishing to see myself at a conference like this. Not that long ago, it would have been unimaginable. A lot of things are happening these days, I think, that would have been unimaginable not long ago. And it's thanks to people like Carlos and so many others of you who have really been witnesses to the possibility of the unimaginable actually happening, that I am here, and I'm very grateful for your inspiring examples. My task, as I understood it originally, was to help somehow bring all of this together now and apply it to Cuba. I'm afraid that I'm going to disappoint you because as I tried to do that, I soon realized that that would be impossible. And in any case, so many of you have much more experience and more wisdom with respect to these issues than I would be able to bring. What I will try to do is to try to offer some reflections, at least on what some of these very rich, excellent presentations have, ways in which they might impact my own thinking, my own self-understanding as a Cuban American, and my own ways of going forward in this process of reconciliation. So I'd like to begin by just offering some personal reflections, a couple of stories, which are not unique to me. I'm sure a number of you have similar stories you could tell. As Carlos, I think, mentioned this morning, I came to the United States as a 6-year-old. So I'm at that second generation that Father Schreider was referring to. And my earliest memory as a child was sitting in the Pan American airplane on the tarmac in Jose Marti Airport, looking out the window at, sitting in the airplane with my mother and grandmother and siblings, waiting to leave from Miami, looking out the window and waving at my father, who was staying behind because he couldn't leave at the time. Fortunately, several weeks later, he was able to come out. But at the time, of course, I had no idea whether I'd ever see my father again. So that experience, I think, is, as we heard this morning, is one experience of pain, one experience of loss that has defined me, I'm sure, up until today, and will define me forever. That is, that my earliest memory is a memory of leaving my father behind. Fast forward a number of years. After we left Cuba, and I grew up in the United States, in the South, it never occurred to me, it never dawned on me that I would ever see Cuba again. That was part of my past, and I was now on to make a life and a living for myself here in this country. I assumed the kinds of positions vis-a-vis Cuba that a lot of my family and friends and the Cuban community had during those years. I just basically didn't want to have anything to do with Cuba. I was now an American. All of that changed in 1998 when Pope John Paul II visited Cuba. It changed not only because I, as a Catholic and a theologian, placed great importance or attached great importance to that visit, but also because of the way in which that visit changed the lives and the views of so many of my family, friends, and others who themselves had previously never conceived of returning to Cuba, and now began talking about going back to Cuba just as the Pope had. It took me a number of years struggling back and forth about whether I really wanted to myself return to Cuba. Several years later, I finally came to the point at which I could say, okay, yes, I want to return I want to return, and I wasn't even sure why I wanted to return. I want to return for the same reason, I guess, as an orphan child wants to return to, go see their parents, parents who maybe they hadn't known or hadn't known since they were children. And I had some of the same fears and anxieties that happens in those kinds of situations. How would my parents receive me? Would they recognize me? How would they turn me away? And so with all of those anxieties, I went to Cuba a few years ago on a humanitarian mission, wondering how the Cuban people would receive me. It didn't take long for my fears to be assuaged, for my fears to disappear. Wherever I went on the island, people would welcome me with open arms. And their response was always the same, almost the exact same words. Gracias por no olvidarnos. Thank you for not forgetting us. Thank you for remembering us. I, who in some very real sense had left them, had abandoned them, if you will, was now being welcomed back with open arms, no questions asked. They weren't saying, how dare you leave us? How dare you go off and make your money and be a success? But rather, thank you for coming back. Thank you for not forgetting us. As a second-generation immigrant, I'm profoundly aware and appreciative of the pain suffered by my parents and grandparents and the sacrifices they made in order to be able to make a living here in this new society, in this new country, and to help me in terms of my own life. This, it seems to me, again, as we heard this morning, is the first step, acknowledging the past, acknowledging the wounds, because the past is not past, it's always a part of the present and will always be a part of the future. The first step, ironically then, in reconciliation, I think, is remembering the pain and really feeling the pain, which is still from us, which is still with us from the past. As William Faulkner once said, the past is not dead, it's not even past. Accepting the fact that the wounds will always be there and that no one can erase them. No matter how hard we try, no matter how angry we get, no matter how much retribution we get, the pain will always be there. The corpses will always be there. The suffering will always be there. The question is, what do we do with it? One of the memories that I have of my recent return to Cuba was of going to the Cementerio Colón, the Colón Cemetery, and going to visit the mausoleum that my family had there, in which there were 6 tombs. Only one of them had a body in them. The other 5 were empty. The other 5 were meant, of course, for relatives of mine who wound up being buried in Spain and in Miami and in other places around the world. So I think that cemetery, that scene of empty tombs, again remains seared in my memory. It's important, I think, and it is important for me to know and accept that those plots will always remain empty. They will never be filled, no matter what happens in the future. That the fear of losing my father will always be part of who I am. Yet, like Jesus' wounds, they can become instruments of transformation, of reconciliation, of resurrection. If we can acknowledge that, in fact, we're all wounded. All Cubans in one way or another are victims of the past 54 years. So again, as we heard this morning, I think we have to get beyond this notion of victimhood, that I'm a victim and you're not, and my victimhood is worse than yours. We have to accept and express publicly our wounds. We have to learn anew to share our wounds, realizing that we're not alone. When we recognize that fact, we will move from being victims to being survivors, as Father Schreider said. Suffering can be, I think, healing when it's undertaken with others. We have to risk making ourselves vulnerable and sharing our wounds with others, even though their wounds may be very different from ours. Our wounds, as we heard this morning, can become sources of healing for others' wounds. Such an acknowledgement, by the way, will also make it possible for us to realize that, believe it or not, Cubans are not unique. When we acknowledge our common woundedness, we can reach out, embrace, and learn from others who have been similarly wounded, whether in South Africa or Northern Ireland or elsewhere. That the wounds themselves can become sources of bonds and reconciliation among people. In the book of Job, a turning point takes place for Job when he realizes that he's not alone in his affliction. I'm not the worst of all possible human beings. There are others who also suffer. So many others have suffered similar fates. This realization empowers Job to step outside his own world and reach out to others in their suffering. Another theme we heard this morning repeatedly is forgiving does not mean forgetting. Indeed, unless we remember, we cannot truly forgive. I would go even further, I think, than saying that we don't have to forget in order to forgive. I would say that we have to remember precisely in order to forgive, because we cannot forgive unless we know what we're forgiving. It cannot be based on truth, as we heard this morning. And again, this is perfectly exemplified in the person of the crucified and risen Jesus Christ. That is, that the wounds remain the instrument, or become the instrument of forgiveness. Look what you apostles have done to me by abandoning me to the Roman soldiers. You have helped inflict those wounds, but guess what? Peace be with you. That's my response to the wounds that you have helped inflict on me. I don't erase them. I don't pretend it didn't happen. Yes, you did betray me. Yes, you did abandon me. But in the midst of that, and even because of that, I am able to forgive you and reconstitute the community that we had before you had abandoned me. This demands, I think, above all, a willingness to take risks of opening ourselves to our brothers and sisters on the island, not only because of what we can do for them, but especially because of what they can do for us. It's not simply a question of altruism, but it's a question of, as I learned when I returned to Cuba, of what I can learn from, how I can be touched and changed by other people who reach out to me in situations where I would not have expected it. It means placing ourselves in situations of vulnerability and risk and allowing us to be changed by those situations. And this can only happen ultimately between persons. And again, this is something we heard this morning. Reconciliation ultimately doesn't happen between governments. Governments may have alliances, all sorts of other things. But reconciliation ultimately happens between persons, and if we're going to be sitting around waiting for the governments to be reconciled with each other, we'll be waiting a long time. I think the task for us is to begin to make at the grassroots level the kinds of build the kinds of personal relationships that will make for and contribute to the rebuilding of civil society in Cuba. Two other things that I think, two of the victims of the last 54 years has been precisely the ability, the willingness to take risks, something that has become virtually impossible, I would say, on both extremes of the debate. People unwilling to risk because they're afraid of what they might lose. And yet, ironically, we as a people, the Cuban people, have always been known, I think, for our risk-taking, our entrepreneurial spirit. And you still see that very much in Cuba. The ability to risk the security of the present in order to improve the future, or to work towards a better future. We need to be able to take that risk, that attitude of risk-taking that we bring to businesses here, or that we bring to our professions, and apply that to relationships. What would happen if we are willing to risk the intransigence of the present in order to risk having real relationships in the future? And that is another victim of the past 54 years has been personhood, the person, the dignity of the person. I think too often we assume that the opposite or the counterpart of totalitarianism is individualism. That's often what we've seen. Communism is totalitarian, capitalism is individualistic, individualism is the opposite of totalitarianism. Well, I think as we've heard this morning, that's not the case at all. In fact, totalitarian governments are the most individualistic governments, I would argue. Totalitarianism depends on individualism to survive, to thrive. Totalitarian governments must turn persons into isolated individuals. Totalitarianism must isolate every person, every individual from every other individual. The real counterpart, an alternative to totalitarian governments, is community, is real community. And that is, I think, what we are about in trying to move towards reconciliation. How do we begin to develop bonds with Cubans and begin to model a new form of civil society? In my return to Cuba, I also discovered that one of the great ironies of the reconciliation process, which Ambassador Razul referred to this morning, which is that sometimes it's the most victimized that are the ones that are most open to reconciliation, ironically, paradoxically. The ones most willing to forgive, the ones most willing to reach out to reconcile and heal are the victims themselves. The ones with the position of least power or least security. Why is it that I've so often experienced that the greatest resentment exists not among Cubans who have had to live under the horrific circumstances that they have lived under in the last 54 years in Cuba, but that the greatest resentment towards other Cubans comes precisely from Cubans who have had such great success, are members of our community in this country, and who have the ability and the power precisely to reach out and help the other Cubans. Why is it that it's the victimized so often that are able to forgive most readily? So the reconciliation of the Cuban community, I think, demands that we commit ourselves to what is a long process, and there's that word again, process, of risk-taking. Like that old Cuban lady who, when I returned to Cuba, embraced and kissed me on the cheek and said, "Thank you for not forgetting us." Like Jesus himself, who appeared to the apostles who had betrayed him and says, "Peace be with you." How do we risk overturning the logic of an eye for an eye, of retribution, in favor of the logic of mercy and reconciliation? A reconciliation that is a process. As we work together towards a new community, towards reconstituting relationships, we begin to build relationships in the process. Even if that means disagreement and debate, which it will mean necessarily. Disagreement, debate, argument is all part of engagement. It's all part of relationships. We have to learn anew how to disagree. Only by risking reconciliation can we stand up to the logic of violence and mistrust that all Cubans whether on the island or in the diaspora, have lived under for the past 54 years. This does not mean, as we heard this morning, that we obviate demands of justice, but justice cannot be its own end. Justice is not its own end. The end of justice is reconciliation. The end of justice is a reconstituted community. That's why justice has to be, as we heard again from Father Schreider and Ambassador Razul, especially restorative justice. Restorative justice recognizes that the goal of justice is a reconstituted community. Restorative justice recognizes that we cannot bring back the dead or the lost years, but it can help make past loss the seedbed of a new future, like Jesus' wounds. Without such a reconciled community, we argue, we cannot have true freedom. For we will continue to be enslaved by our fears, our anger, and our resentment. Our wounds will continue to control our lives, as Father Schreider said. We cannot be free. We cannot be free and still be enslaved by our wounds. How do we, true freedom will only come about when we're all free, when we're all able to relate to each other as free human beings. How do we create spaces? And you all have, well, the Cuba Study Group is one such space, but there are many other spaces. How do we create spaces for this kind of risk-taking, this kind of person-to-person reconciliation? How do we create spaces that will allow and facilitate people to risk doing what we had assumed was impossible? As Pat Doherty said, the British government could not possibly be in dialogue with Irish Republicans. How do we create spaces in our community that will facilitate us and encourage us to start looking for our keys where we lost them and not where the light happens to be shining? How do we create spaces that will allow us to risk vulnerability? A vulnerability that will make it possible for us to learn that maybe that other person is not exactly who I thought he or she was just because they played a particular role in the government, or a particular role in the church, or a particular role in the Cuban community. How do we create spaces that will allow us to risk learning that I'm not the one who I thought I was? That I am not, I don't have it as together, that I don't know everything there is to know, that maybe my perspective is not absolutely correct. There was, as I mentioned earlier, there was one time at which a conference like this one would have been deemed impossible. And yet here we are. So step by tiny step, I think we must learn to do what we had always assumed was impossible, become accustomed to doing the impossible. It demands a new reprogramming. Like Thomas standing before Jesus, it's impossible that Jesus has been raised, that he appeared to the apostles. But Jesus says, touch my wounds, wounds that you have helped inflict. Peace be with you. Do not be unbelieving, but believe. If we all dare to bear our wounds to ourselves and each other, we can all experience a resurrection together. The resurrection of a community, not the resurrection of individuals. The resurrection of a community that has been destroyed. More importantly, as a second-generation Cuban, I know that I owe such a future to my children and my grandchildren. And those are words that we haven't heard too much about here today, but that are certainly on my mind here today. I owe this to my children and my grandchildren. Even if we remain enslaved by our past, we must not allow our children and grandchildren to be enslaved by that past. By embarking on the process of reconciliation, we will be taking perhaps the greatest risk in the history of our people, but it's a risk we owe our children. Dad, what did you do when that window or door was open? Did you ignore it? Did you close it up? What will I tell my children and grandchildren 10 or 20 years from now? That I was too afraid or too self-righteous to walk through that open door? We ourselves also betray our parents and grandparents if we allow their suffering, their loss, and their death to define our children's lives. The alternative is continued mistrust for generations to come. 54 years have ingrained mistrust in our people. It is simply the air Cubans breathe. If we do not risk changing that default position of mistrust, we will simply continue this pattern of betrayal and reprisal, for we will have betrayed our own children. And we will betray our parents and grandparents, whose suffering will never be allowed to become a seedbed of resurrection in our community. I thus owe a commitment to reconciliation, not just to my children and grandchildren, but to those empty tombs in the Cementerio Colón. That the suffering of those who have come before me will not have been in vain, that their suffering and deaths do not have the last word, and that the last 54 years of our common anguish do not have the last word. Thank you.